Welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where we in general discuss property investment, success, money, but today we're going to be talking about demographics, the demographic changes that are going to affect our housing markets and business in the medium to long term. In fact, I think that's more important than what's going to happen to interest rates or what's going to happen to the economy. So I'm pleased to once again be chatting with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. Now, if you don't know Simon, he's the co-founder of the Demographics Group, and he's a master in interpreting data and trends that help us forecast how our society is going to move forward. But I think these insights are really pivotal to anyone who's interested in property, because if you're in property, you're in small business providing service, providing accommodation. So it's going to be important to understand the changes that are going to happen. Now, recently, Simon wrote a series of articles in the New Daily outlining the changes he sees ahead for us over the next decade. We spoke a little bit about this about a month ago, but this is going into more depth in other areas, the shifts that are going to happen and what this means for our future. So if you're a property investor planning to get into property, or you're a business owner, you're going to want to understand what these mean for you. And like all my regular chats with Simon, I think you're going to get some interesting, thought-provoking discussion. So let's dive into it.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Over the last 10 years, the changes in Australia have seemed gradual. But if you look back, you can see that there have been some significant changes that are shaping our nation, the sort of nation our children are going to inherit over the next decade. Now, recently, Australia's leading demographer, Simon Kuestenmacher, wrote a series of articles for the New Daily delving into what these shifts mean for our future. So let's look at some of his thoughts. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Michael. Great to be back on the show.
Last month, we had a chat about how you saw the next decade playing out for the various demographic groups. And if our listeners hasn't listened to that, I'd suggest going back on your podcast player and having a listen to that episode. But let's have a look at some of the thoughts you did in your series in the New Daily at the end of last year. And one of the big topics you discussed was the millennial housing shift.
What millennials are doing is making babies in the next decade, and that means we need to get them out of their current small 1 and 2 bedroom apartment in the inner city and get them into a 3 and 4 bedroom dwelling. These dwellings are not available in the middle suburbs. That's because their baby boomer parents are hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom homes there, and they're great NIMBYs, so they block development as much as they can. So millennials jump all the way to the urban fringe, where greenfield sites are developing 3 and 4 bedroom housing stock at scale. That trend will continue for the next 10 years. It is baked into the demographic pie. There aren't two opinions about this, to be quite frank. So we know what millennials will be doing.
Well, policymakers know that we haven't got enough accommodation, so they're looking to provide, well, we know they said 1.2 million dwellings over the next 5 years, but they're talking about building them in the more expensive inner and middle ring suburbs. I can't see how that's going to work, Simon, if you're actually going to talk about finding them amongst the most expensive areas for land and then using the most expensive construction techniques, Simon, building high-rise towers compared to homes. Are we ever going to be able to afford or be able to build affordable accommodation the way the politicians are talking about?
Yeah, well, so if you look at the urban planning documents from each capital city, they tend to have something like a 70-30 infill goal. That means 70% of population growth is meant to happen in infill sites within the city, whereas only 30% happens on new land that you bulldoze on the outskirts of town. That is a lovely planning goal. It's best urban planning practice. I applaud it. It's wonderful, but it's also utterly unrealistic, because we are growing the country at 300 to 400,000 people per year. That means we need to build at least 150, 180,000 dwellings per year. We need to build housing fast. And these dwellings, where do we put them? What's the fastest way of building a dwelling stock? The fastest way at the moment is to bulldoze land and to put a relatively cheap house on top. That's the fastest we can do it. We will go back to these things because we have no other choice, to be honest.
So you're talking about more dwellings in the outer suburbs?
Yeah, I think urban sprawl is not finished just yet. Ideally, it would be, because already the urban footprint of a Australian city is about 4 times, 5 times the footprint that it would have in Europe. An equally sized city in Europe is about a quarter the size of an Australian city. And that means that each and every taxpayer pays for 4 times the amount of rail and road and sewage and electricity grid and so forth. It's just, we do it the most expensive way. Urban sprawl does look cheap in the short term because you buy a cheaper house, but everything else is just so much more expensive that it makes sense that we stop. From an urban planning perspective, we stop the sprawl. We try to push towards infill, but we still deal with a massive population growth of 300,000 to 400,000 people per year. And if you want to provide this housing at scale, you need to build quite a bit of housing on the outskirts. No way around it.
Now, you've also been outspoken about who should plan our urban growth. At the moment, there's, I guess, 3 levels of government. We've got here the federal government, which gives the big picture policy of let's build 1.2 million homes, the state governments, which have got their own budgets, and the local councils, who seem to be more responsive, Simon, to the ratepayers and the voters. And that's why I think we've got a lot of trouble in the middle suburbs, where there's lots more NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and we've also got notes, not over there either.
Yeah, this is almost in defense of local council now. Local councils must be NIMBYs. They're not incentivized to development. If you put yourself into the shoes of a elected councillor, if you vote any development, even if it's the most appropriate, fantastic development through, somebody will hate you for it. Usually it's a neighbor, somebody will have more cars in their roads and whatever, they hate it, and then they will not vote for it. If you're a smart, self-interested councillor, you vote absolutely everything down that comes across your desk. And if it's really important, VCAT or NCAT, whatever the jurisdiction is, pushes it through. And then you can wash your hands clean and say, oh, dear voter, I tried my best. It's the evil bureaucrats who pushed it through. That is because we give relatively strong powers in terms of vetoing to local governments. It makes sense that we have this division of power because there is local intelligence included in the decision making. That's good. So now, though, in a sense, particularly the inner and middle councils in the big cities kind of misused their powers. That's especially in Victoria and New South Wales the case, because they just said, we block all development, we just push it through. So you kick the can down the roads until you reach the outskirts of town where there are no neighbors to object and councils can then actually okay the development. The states kind of caught on to this now. They realized, hey, if we want to set really strict and strong housing targets to each and every single local government area, we need to take the vetoing power away from them. I call this the big power grab from the states. The states are snatching as much power as they can from local government. You will not see a shortage of news stories in the next years where a local councillor, the mayor of Brisbane, the mayor of Melbourne, the mayor of this or that local government area complains very, very harshly about the unfair, ludicrous treatment from the state. This will be your number one news story, if you will, on the political side of housing, and will be that. But ultimately, the states will win. And ultimately, each and every local government area will get stricter housing targets, because at the moment, the states haven't even touched the stick. They just used the carrot approach, where they said, we have this new pool of money. If you fulfill your housing targets, you get a chunk of that money. The next step will be to withhold existing funding. The step after this would be to put a council under administration. Then the councillors are out of a job. So the self-interested councillor of today should actually see the writing on the wall and should become pro-growth on their own accord in order to manage the growth, in order to have a say on how local growth is occurring. The sheer act of blocking was a nightmare in the past, and it will be killing your job in the future.
Well, in our last chat, we spoke a bit about this in more detail. So if you haven't listened to that, please go back. But Simon, in your series of articles in the New Daily, you also talked about the global economic landscape, because clearly Australia doesn't operate in isolation. And you were suggesting there was a looming general economic slowdown.
Yeah, so the global economy won't be all that swell in the next decade. Part of this has to do with global demographics, because you have the big fat baby boomer cohort moving into retirement. That means their investment strategies change. You know this when you talk to your own financial advisor. They will, when you're young, they will encourage you to take a couple of riskier bets, but the older you get, the more boring your investments are meant to be. So now the global pool of capital wants to become more boring over the next couple of decades. That means less money for crazy, innovative Facebook, Google type startups, more money for boring infrastructure, bonds, property. So that will ultimately work in Australia's favor because we have a lot of boring to offer. The innovation landscape here isn't nearly as strong as it should be. So we're not missing out on all that much creative capital that all of a sudden stops existing because we never had it. We provide a secure investment platform for anyone willing to invest into housing and property. So Australia will open up increasingly and will soften regulation to welcome more foreign capital into the country, to buy infrastructure, to buy property, to develop property, not to buy, actually, to develop property.
Yep. Well, we've spoken before about Australia's economy being sound while the rest of the world has its challenges. You've often spoken about the 4 ways that we make money in Australia. Our business plan is to dig things out of the ground and sell them, minerals to grow things in the ground and sell them, and we could be the food bowl of this modern developing Southeast Asia. We educate people and tourists like coming here. So that sounds pretty good. But we also, at the moment, very dependent upon China. What do you see about its stability moving forward?
Yeah, so China, demographically speaking, is probably the worst country on the planet. They are going to halve their population base by the end of the century, if not before that. So that doesn't sound all that swell, but China, even at half the population, will be 700 million people strong. And we do not tend to really do business with China. We tend to be doing business with what is called the global Chinese middle class. So these are people that are rich enough to be consumers at a global scale. That sliver of society in China is about 200 to 300 million people strong, depending on who you listen to. In theory, this could still grow the relevant cohort that we are doing business with, compared to, even if the population starts shrinking. Plus, the main things that we have to offer China will need anyways. This is food and energy. China is a net importer of food and energy. If China, God forbid, was ever to be put under a Russian-style international set of sanctions, they would have hundreds of millions of people starve within 2 years. And that needs to be avoided, obviously. So even if you think about, there's this trade war between China and the US and whatever, China will find a way to ensure that our shippies with food and energy make their way to their ports.
Maybe not lobsters, maybe not wine. They don't.
Exactly. So that's another issue. China regularly puts lobsters or wine on the no-go list. But that's what China needs to do as a global, or not a global, as a regional powerhouse, is they constantly need to slap our wrist and say, no more this or that from you, for you. They're punishing a bit in order to show who is the bigger partner. But strategically speaking, China needs us much more than we need China, because we only get money from China. Boo-hoo. China gets food and energy from us. Orders of magnitudes more important than money.
Interesting. Now, again, as we look forward over the next decade, you wrote an article about our workforce and educational trends. We're becoming a more educated society. We often talk about the 5 skill levels, and it's not a judge of people, but the more educated they are, the more they're going to earn over time, the different sort of jobs they need. What do you see happening there, Simon?
Well, we will see more people going to university. We'll have more people with very high qualifications, academic qualifications. That's all well and good. But the pay premium that you get for a university degree will probably shrink because we have this crazy shortage in trades. And if you know any self-employed tradesmen, they would have done really well over the last couple of years. Sure, they're good business people, whatever, they take cash, but more than anything, it's just this crazy shortage of them that allows them to charge really strong prices. And bit by bit, the market will catch up on this. And more young people will realize, if they are so inclined, that a trade would be a good career path. So that should then make trades a bit more affordable, but still super lucrative for people. And we'll also see TAFE fees being abolished. It was one of the dumber things we've done in Australia, was to charge for a TAFE level education. Yes, you get a pay premium for a TAFE degree compared to not having a TAFE degree. But overall, the pay premium isn't all that juicy. So it really discouraged people to go into the trades. The people said, well, if I pay a fee, I might as well go to uni, do that. And so you artificially devalued the trades. You then, through the devaluation of trades, you actually created an overvaluation of the costs of trading. So now they're super expensive. And bit by bit, the market will adjust for this by making TAFE free and more people going into those trades. But yeah, if you're so inclined, become a tradie. Great money lies in there, because lots and lots of trades will lose jobs like crazy, because we have the baby boomers leaving the world of work in the next 10 years, and they are leaving massive vacancies in the workforce behind.
Well, not everyone wants to work in an office. Not everyone is comfortable sitting down all day in front of a computer. So there's great opportunities for trades. Lastly, what lifestyle, what society type changes do you see happening? How are we going to entertain ourselves? What are we going to do over the next decade?
Well, I think most of those basic trends will stay the same. Yes, technology will change things a bit. Every now and then you get all those news stories about new goggles, new VR, augmented reality. Sure enough, but it will still be roughly the same thing. You will consume your stupid TV shows and cat memes on a different platform. That's about it. I don't see major changes there. And if you look into the past, you will see that things haven't changed all that much. Passive entertainment, watching TV, watching YouTube, it's the same thing. Yes, you kind of consume slightly different contexts and whatever, but ultimately the human nature will not change. We will continue to make babies within this biological window in which we can make babies. That'll stay the same. So from an entertainment perspective, I'm not seeing all that much change. I'm a bit nervous in the short to medium term about AI flooding the news sphere, meaning the news sources that we consume are just flooded with relatively easily and cheaply produced, not so smart content.
Yes.
And that will lead to a revaluation of how we consume media. So I'm seeing a stronger future actually for the currently existing mainstream news sources, because they will not so much be the creators of content, but they will be the curators of content. They will be filtering things out for you. Plus, you'll see more and more subject matter experts emerge that filter content for you, and that then in their own right become a certain authority. You are one of those authorities, Michael. People come to you for kind of property advice, and you need to filter through a whole lot of nonsense.
That takes time and perspective. So I can actually see patterns in the chaos because I've been around for 5 decades doing it. So thank you. That actually gives me some comfort that people will still be interested in my thoughts in 10 years' time. We also know that with all these millions of people coming to Australia, they all need cars. What's going to happen to our roads? Are we going to have self-driving cars? Are we going to get Uber cars instead, hire cars, or are we just going to be stuck longer on the freeways?
Well, we will still be car dependent in our cities. That will not change. The urban planning narrative, if you talk to young planners, is very much pro-active transport, cycling, walking, pro-public transport. But if you look at the hard demographic realities, over the next 10 years, you have the millennials, the biggest cohort of them all, moving into the 2-car per household phase of the life cycle. You have them moving from the small apartment in the inner city where they got away without a car potentially to the urban fringe where they definitely need 2 cars. So bit by bit, this actually drives the car sales up in Australia. Over the next 10 years, the baby boomers are still too young, too healthy to stop driving. So they are not going from 1 car down to 0 cars. There will be remaining 2 to 1 car households. So the car will be strong in the coming decade. Yes, we'll bit by bit transition to more electric vehicles first. I would argue that the self-driving car is much further away than we do it justice now, especially self-driving trucks. They will not be here anytime soon other than on very specific, mining sites and so forth. And I'm actually quite nervous about truck drivers because we have a crazy truck driver shortage at the moment, and we have a massive chunk of the existing truck drivers aged 55 to 64, meaning they will fall off the retirement cliff in the next 10 years. We do not have enough truck drivers, and we will need to import them from overseas. We can't possibly produce even a small percentage of them here. It's utterly unquestionable.
Well, I always love our chats, and I think what I got out of this is the future. Despite the technology, the advances, it seems like it's going to mirror the past, maybe more than we think it will be. And even though we only see changes happening slowly, if you look back over time, they are significant. But we live in the best country in the world, and despite all the challenges, probably the best time in the world, Simon. So I look forward to catching up with you once a month for these regular chats.
Fantastic. Looking forward to the next one.
I hope my chat with Simon Kuestenmacher shows you that despite all the challenges in the world, the big picture for Australia over the next decade is very positive. Of course, that's how successful property investors think. They think about where the markets are going to be in 10 years, not where interest rates are going to be in 6 months' time. Now, if you're a regular listener to this show, but you don't, or even a new one, but you don't currently subscribe to this podcast, please just stop for a second on whatever podcast app you're listening to. Just follow or subscribe so twice a week you're going to get the regular updates from my expert guests and myself. And it'd also be great if you could leave a review. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share my popular mindset message with you. But I want to remind you that Simon Kuestenmacher is going to be at Wealth Retreat on the Gold Coast at the end of April. So may I ask you a direct question? Is your current peer group really supporting your goals in taking your property, investing, your business, your life in general to the level you want to be at? I found too many Australians get stuck simply because they don't have the right peer group and the right advisor network to help get them to the next level. So here's your chance to upgrade your peer group, to get a whole level of other advisors. And as I said, Simon Kuestenmacher, Mark Burris, Pete Wargent, me, Brett Warren, Ken Race, Mark Creedon, a whole group of people. I've left out a whole lot of names are going to be at Wealth Retreat for the best faculty I could put together, Hung Choi for finance. But it's also the other delegates that are there, and I speak to everyone who comes to Wealth Retreat, and there are some very, very successful property investors and business people there. But don't count yourself out. Please go to wealthretreat.com.au, find out all about it, and register your interest, and I'll speak to you. And if I believe you'd get benefit from it, I'll back you with my money back guarantee. It's your opportunity to meet a new peer group of determined, successful property investors. The common comment I get from people I speak to is, I don't have the right people around me. I don't have people to talk with about this. They don't understand how I'm thinking. So it's your opportunity to meet a new peer group of determined, successful property investors, business owners. But it's actually going to give you a concrete roadmap, step by step, to get to the next stage of your life. The aim of Wealth Retreat is where you're going to be in 5 years' time. You're going to learn real-world realities to take advantage of the property markets as they reset in front of our eyes later this year. So this is your, I guess, once every now and then opportunity. We only do it once a year on the Gold Coast at the end of April this year. So wealthretreat.com.au, leave us your details, and I'd love to have a personal chat with you to help you on your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share with you a question that was asked in an email I received recently from Sahil Bloom. It's called Curiosity Chronicle. And the question he asked was, if you knew you would die in 10 years' time, what would you do today? He said everyone has seen the shorter term versions of this question. What would you do if today was your last day? What would you do if you knew you'd die in a year? Frankly, I find these questions not really helpful, as the answers usually involve dramatic changes. I mean, if I knew I was going to die tomorrow, I certainly wouldn't be producing this podcast right now. If I knew I was going to die in a year, I'd probably spend every single moment with Pam, my wife, my children, my family, my grandchildren, and my friends. That's not a particularly useful insight in terms of impacting my day-to-day actions. But the time horizon that Sahil Bloom mentioned, 10 years. Now, that seems to work. 10 years is long enough for you still to have a lot of time left, but short enough that it's very quantifiable. So let me ask you, what changes would you make if you knew you weren't around in 10 years' time? What big things would you finally pursue? What fears would melt away? What new fears would appear? What would you remove from your life? What would you spend your time doing? Who would you spend your life with? So my suggestion is spend a little bit of time thinking about this. My guess is the question will bring a few life changes to the surface, changes that will be worth making. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?